Awesome, thank you. All right, so today we are going to be presenting Power Platform Zen for IT, and it's about finding the balance between creativity and control. My name is Hugo Bernier. I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft, and originally scheduled to be with me was April Dunham. Unfortunately, she won't be able to present today, so I will be presenting both her content and my content. But we have a lot of stuff to talk about, and we have an hour or so, so let's get moving. First of all, I would like to thank our sponsors.
Just one question, so sorry. Yep. Are you sharing your screen?
I am, but you know what? I was supposed to be, but I realized that
yeah.
There you go.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, so I'll just actually go back to our screen, our contact details here, just in case people need to get a hold of us. And let's just move on. Thank you for letting me know, because that would have been a long hour. All right, so let's talk about Power Platform for a second. So according to our friend Satya Nadella, there's going to be over 500 million new apps that will be built in the next 5 years. Just to put that in context, that's going to be more than all the apps built in the last 40 years. You know, so that's insane. We're talking about 5 years over 40 years, right? And what's going to happen is the demand for mobile apps is going to be growing by about five times faster than the IT departments can deliver. And that's according to Gartner, right? So you don't have to believe me. Gartner says it, so it must be true. The other thing to consider is that 86% of organizations struggle to find like the right technical talent to build their applications. And that's our friends at Indeed that came up with these statistics. So this is not looking good. We've got more demand, we got more applications that need to be built, and we have less people to find to be able to do this. And then to make things even worse, right? The majority of applications, 65%, so more than half of all the enterprise applications developed in by 2024, that's not that far off, are going to be low code applications. That's insane, right? So we have to change something. And fortunately, there's the technology that's available out there, the Microsoft Power Platform, which is what this whole session is about, is really about empowering people, right, to elevate their talents and to really combine all the services that Microsoft offers into like a powerful low-code platform. And you know, yeah, okay, the Power Platform has capabilities that will impress like any seasoned developers, but it's really designed to be approachable and accessible to those who are in the best position to really identify like these are the opportunities to improve my business. The people that work on the front lines of the business, like the person in accounting who understands an accounting problem better than any IT person could ever. And that's the problem with usually traditional coding applications, is that we always have to translate, right? The people who know the problem, understand the problem, have to translate it to the IT people. And that act of translating often, you know, there's a lot of stuff that gets lost in translation. And when we're talking about things like digital transformations, right, it means to be more efficient and use the data that you have to get some insights, which will help make it possible for you to make more intelligent business process and decisions. And so we can't achieve this kind of efficiency, I guess we can call it, if we only have programmers and data scientists and tech professionals, because first of all, there's not enough of them, and two is they don't necessarily speak in that domain of expertise that is needed. So there's always that loss or being lost in translation. So one of the really foundational goals of the Power Platform is to empower kind of that limitless potential of citizen developers, people who are not developers for a living, but do want to make an impact, do want to make a change, and use the capabilities of the Power Platform to like kind of unlock all those insights that they have and develop processes that would otherwise never happen just because we just can't keep up. So the Power Platform has Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agent, and things like Dataverse and AI Builder. But I suspect that you wouldn't be attending this session if you didn't know what Power Platform is about. So this is not what today is about. Today is about finding that perfect balance, right? Achieving that Zen status. Because on one side, I want to empower the creativity. I want to empower the makers and the citizen developers to do the stuff that they have identified as important to do. And then at the same time, I want to have control, right? So how do I empower like the IT department and the enterprise architects and InfoSec people and data people and service management people and help desk, right? Because that's the one thing that people forget about is, yeah, I'm going to build this mission critical solution using low code, no code. But our help desk people are never going to be involved in the process, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be asked to support it. Well, thankfully, there's a process to achieve that balance, and there's lots and lots of tools. Now, I've actually kind of tried to focus on some key areas, but let's talk about that path to Zen. So we're going to cover a lot, by the way, and I apologize if I go quickly. Again, I'm always happy to help if you have any questions. So let's talk first of all about securing. And so why am I talking about securing first? Why wouldn't I talk about all the other stuff that traditionally people tell you about when you want to adopt Power Platform? Well, here's the thing, is when you start by adopting, you don't have control over what people are going to do, right? So if you don't secure things early, you're potentially exposing yourself, right? But if you start by securing things and then start allowing people to use the Power Platform, you're actually creating an environment that they can be creative, but you can still control and protect. So let's talk about three ways that you can secure, right? Well, first thing is about establishing DLP policies. What are DLP policies? Well, DLP policies are data loss prevention, so DLP policies. I hear a lot of people say, oh, it's a DLP, not a DLP policy. No, because it's data loss prevention policy. So DLP policy, and they're kind of like the guardrails that will help you keep you on the road, right? They help prevent the users from unintentionally exposing your organizational data or your private information, and to protect the information security in a tenant. The DLP policies, they'll enforce some rules that they'll enforce rules about which connectors are enabled in each environment and which connectors can be used together. So you can actually scope DLP policies at the environment level and at the tenant level. And so it gives you that flexibility to, when you combine these things together, you can craft policies that are really kind of make sense. There's, and they don't block high productivity. The environment DLP policies can't override the tenant-wide DLP policies, which is important. And if you have multiple policies that are configured for one environment, it's always going to be the most restrictive policy that will apply to the whole combination of all the connectors. So by default, by the way, there are no DLP policies that are implemented in your tenant. And DLP policies can be applied at the user level, only at the environment or tenant level. Your DLP policies they're connected aware, but they can't control the connections that are made using the connectors. So in other words, right, so DLP policies don't know whether you're using the connector to connect to a dev environment, a test environment, or production environment. It just knows whether it's used in that environment itself. And by the way, I'm going to show you today ways to create policies using the screens, but you can actually use PowerShell and admin connectors to manage policies as well. And by the way, users that are in the environment that are using the resources can view the policies that apply, right? It only makes sense. They should be able to know why I'm not able to connect to Twitter and broadcast all the customer data, and it'll actually tell you, and we'll explain that in a minute. All right, so let's talk about classifications, because classifications is kind of the essence of DLP policies. Classifications kind of draw the boundaries around the connectors, right? If you know Power Platform has all these connectors that you can use in your Power Apps and Power Automate, but kind of establishing business and non-business classifications around what connectors can be used together in a given app or a given Power Automate flow. And these connectors can be kind of classified across the either business, non-business, or blocked. So business are just like any given Power App or Power Automate resource can use one or more connectors from a business group. But if a Power App or Power Automate resource uses a business connector, it cannot be used with any non-business connector. Again, the example of getting all your list of customers and getting Twitter, is probably not a good idea. You probably don't want that kind of information to cross boundaries. A non-business, classification, any given Power App or Power Automate resource that uses a non-business connector, that's fine. But if that app or Power Automate resource uses a non-business connector, it cannot use any business connector. So it's the reverse rule of what we just talked about before. And then you can actually block a connector. So, if you block a connector, there's no Power App or Power Automate resource that can use that connector from that block group. Now, there are some caveats, right? All Microsoft-owned premium connectors and third-party connectors can be blocked, but the standard connectors and the common data services connectors cannot be blocked because they're kind of the key to everything there is within Microsoft. So again, the out of the box or the I don't want to say free, the standard connectors, you can't block those because they're always just talking to your own data, your own SharePoint and Teams and things like that. It's anything that goes outside of those boundaries that you can choose to block them because you want to reduce the additional cost that would be incurred by having a premium connector, or because you just don't want people to leak information. And by the way, when I'm talking about business and non-business, those names don't have a special meaning, right? They're just simply labels. The grouping of the connectors themselves is what's important, right? Not the name of the group that they're placed in. So if you wanted to create an ethical wall between two boundaries and that's not necessarily called business and non-business, that's perfectly fine. But let's talk about creating a policy. So create a policy, you would go to your Power Platform Admin Center. And from the Power Platform Admin Center, you would click on Data Policies. And in the Data Policies, if you haven't created any data policy, more than likely what you'll have is something that says no policies created. And then you would click on New Policy. Now today, in the screenshots that I've taken, what I'll do is I'll add SharePoint and Salesforce to the business data group. And then we'll also add Facebook and Twitter to the block data group. That way, all the other connectors will set them to non-business data group. That way, we'll be able to make sure that, again, people are not sending data where they shouldn't be able to send it. And we'll also exclude things like dev environment and test environments from the scope of this policy, and we'll apply the policy to all the other environments, and you'll see how that goes. So again, I would go to Data Policies, New Policy, and then from there, I would say name your policy. So you give it a name, any name you want. Now remember that people can see those policies, so don't call them like Denzel sucks because Denzel might actually see that. Then you go to your connectors, right? It's going to ask you, here's the pre-built connectors, and then you would actually pick the connectors you want. So in this case, I picked Salesforce. Now you'll notice that I could actually search for connectors, and if I've classified my connectors, I could look for them by business, non-business, or blocked. In this case, I happen to see the Salesforce connector right there, so I'll just click on that. And then I'll actually say, I want to move this connector to the business. So again, a connector can only reside in one data group at a time. You can move, let's say, if we do SharePoint and Salesforce like this, to the business group, we're preventing users from creating flows from any flows and apps that combine the business and non-business groups are blocked. Now, there's connectors like SharePoint. They're not blockable, like we said, because they're built into kind of the standard connectors. So the block button, which you see right here, it would be disabled if you tried to do this for SharePoint. And again, just so you understand, it's not broken, it's by design. All right, so once you've added your connector, so in this case, again, we've rinsed and repeat, we've added the Salesforce connector and the SharePoint connector to the business group. Then I'll skip actually going to the blocked ones. I'll just go directly to setting the default group. So what I can do here is I can say, according to this policy, all other connectors are considered non-business. So that means that they can't be combined with anything else. So I go in the upper right corner, I click on Set Default Group, and then after it'll prompt you for your group, you pick non-business, and then after you do that, you click on Next, well, Apply, and then Next, and then you'll have a new feature. You may or may not have seen this new feature, but because now we can actually do independent connectors, you know, it would be easy for anyone. You could say, well, I'm going to block this, you know, this ServiceNow connector, but there's nothing that stops someone from creating their own custom connectors and just bypass your policies. But you can actually create new connector patterns. So I'll skip this for today, but with connector patterns, I could actually put patterns that would say, if anything goes to this URL, I want to block it. I don't care what the connector is called, I want to block it, right? So that's a great way to protect the information in a more controlled way. And once you've done that, you define the scope. So you say, I want this to apply to, in this case, I want it to apply to every environment, but some environments. So I want it to work on, I want this policy to work everywhere, but maybe dev, right? So we'll do that. We'll just select dev. And then once you've selected it, you can say add it to the policy and create your policy. And once you've created your policy, you'll get an awesome policy that will be applied to the environments. Now you would rinse and repeat that. We'll talk about kind of the environment strategy very soon, but let's talk about kind of what these DLP policies strategy look like, right? It really depends on your environment, and it goes hand in hand with your environment strategy. But until you establish your environment policy, enable your DLPs so that no one in your organization can use the Power Platform in an unsecure way, right? In a way where they're sharing information they shouldn't be sharing. So you've got kind of things that are shared or environments that are for shared users and teams, kind of things that are called productivity environments. And you got like the production environments, like the business unit and project environments. And then there's like that little intersection where the two kind of cross. Let's start by talking about your shared user and team productivity environments. So some of the policies that I would recommend you do is, first of all, create a policy that spans all environments except the selected ones, like the production environments that we've talked about in the other little bubble, and keep the available connectors in this policy like limited to like the Microsoft 365 and other standard microservices, and block access to everything else. This policy will only apply to the default environment, and maybe if you have like training environments or things like that that you're using for running internal training events, you can apply that there, because again, you're only as secure as your weakest link. So if you block the default environment, but you create a training environment that allows anyone to go in and to connect to data, then you're not really secure, are you? All right. The other thing that will happen if you do this is this policy will also apply to any new environment that are created, even if you didn't plan for it, and that's great. Now, on the other side, you also want to create a more appropriate and more permissive policy for your shared users and teams productivity environments, not the default environment. So these policies could allow, let's say, makers to use connectors like Azure services in addition to their Microsoft 365 services. And the connectors will be available in these environments. They will depend on the organization, where the organization stores the business data, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, so on the flip side of the personal productivity, we got the production environments, which are more like business units and project environments, where on this case, what I would do is I would recommend that you use kind of you exclude the environments from the shared user and team productivity policies, the one we just defined. And then you work with the individual business units and projects to establish which connectors and connector combinations they'll be using to create a tenant policy to include all the selected environments only. So the environment admins of those environments, then they can use the environment policies to categorize custom connectors as business data only if required. That's a great way to make sure that, again, someone doesn't elevate their privileges and go into the production environment and actually just start tweeting information. I don't know why I have such a hate on for Twitter today. I love Twitter. All right. Now there's kind of like that intersection, right? Or maybe what I should have drawn here is kind of globally, you've got some policies that should be applied or some rules that should be applied. The first one is you kind of want to create as little policies per environment as possible. There's no strict hierarchy between like the tenant and environment policies, and at design and runtime, the policies that apply to that environment for the app or the flow will be evaluated together to decide whether the resources are in compliance or in violation of those policies. So if you have multiple DLP policies applied to one environment, or I'm talking about like many, it will start fragmenting your connector space in complicated ways. And remember, we're talking about having a balance between creativity and control. So if you just lock it down so much that people can't use it because it's just counterproductive, then it's not going to work, right? So try to balance this, and then having your policies centrally managed using tenant level policies, and using only environment policies to categorize custom connectors or exception cases is probably a good idea. That way, well, it's kind of like the equivalent of when people used to create like individual SharePoint site groups versus having more centralized security groups, right? You don't want to be, well, maybe you do, but more likely you shouldn't be trying to create individual policies that will just create a job for you to just be managing policies. So create policies centrally, use environment policies to deal with exceptions, and then start with that. And then you're going to have all the other exceptions, right? Then it's easy. Like anything that's outside of those little bubbles, it's easy for you to handle the exceptions, because to handle the exceptions, you can just either deny the request, you can add the connectors as default DLP policy, or you can add the environments to the all except list for the global default data loss prevention policy. And then you can create use case specific DLP policies with the exceptions that are included. So you've got everything covered. But that was just the first part of securing. Second part of securing is setting up Azure AD conditional access. Now, Azure AD conditional access, that doesn't sound like something a maker would do, and it isn't. It's more for the administrator, right? Azure AD conditional access are kind of like if-then statements that allows you, it's kind of like your customs officer, right? They're the ones that will decide, what can happen. So for example, you could say, if a user wants to access a resource, then they must complete an action. For example, payroll manager wants to access the payroll app that has been built with Power Apps, then they're required to perform multi-factor authentication to access it. So your administrators there are faced with two primary goals. One is to empower users to be more productive whenever and wherever, but two is to protect the organizational assets and the data. Now here's a gratuitous diagram that talks about how this whole thing works, but you've got things like user and location and devices and applications and real-time risk. Like maybe right now we're under attack and that should affect what's going on. Or maybe the person is just logged in from Toronto and then 10 minutes later tries to log in from Singapore. That's impossible travel. What's going on, right? So apply these things and then verify every access. So you can either allow, you can require multi-factor, or you can block access. Now the great thing about that is, again, you can apply those right access controls that are needed to kind of keep your environment secure. And you can stay out of your user's way when they're not needed. The conditional access policies are enforced after the first factor authentication has been completed. So by just a single login, right away it applies, and then it decides what it will do next. Only global admins can configure conditional access policies. So this is not available for Power Platform or Dynamics admins. It's probably expected. Let's talk about the next way you can secure, right? So we've talked about kind of policies. We've talked about using conditional access. Those are kind of the bare minimum. But the other one is, let's say you're working with other tenants and you need to establish cross-tenant isolation. So cross-tenant isolation, it's kind of like it blocks the inbound and outbound connections. So you can restrict what your tenants and makers can connect to, and you can apply the connector. You can apply this at the connector level, and you can decide. This can go in, this cannot go out. For example, for both Canvas apps and flows. So here's an example here where we have our friends at Contoso and Fabricam. So Contoso users are blocked from being able to connect using their Fabricam credentials, but our Fabricam users can establish connections using the Contoso credentials. So we're able to create policies that will disable that. And restricting that outbound connection means that a user in your tenant is blocked from connecting to any third-party tenant. And it's a great way to do this. Now you can redirect inbound connections, and that would mean that if a user and a third-party tenant is blocked from, they would be blocked from creating a connection to your tenant. And restricting that inbound cross-tenant connection will require them to actually create a support ticket. And that restriction will then only apply to Power Apps and Power Automate. So again, this is not something that's really intended for the makers. This is something that's really intended for the administrators, but it's a great way to block everything. So as you can see now, we've actually kind of created environments that are secure by using policies, by using all the 3 ways that we've just covered. That means that people can start being creative without necessarily creating shadow IT and kind of creating leaking data. All right, but there's more, and I've pretty much covered half of the presentation on security, and that's by design. Let's talk about the other things that are there, right? So the next thing that you want to do after you've secured everything is you kind of want to nurture people, right? You want to encourage people by educating them and empowering them. And I always use the analogy of the coffee machine, right? I worked for one of my clients was a company that they dealt with very sensitive data and everything, and they had Power Apps and Power Automate enabled on all their tenants, but they never showed anybody how to use it. You would never even mention the Power the P word in the organization because of it's just a taboo subject. However, they got a new coffee machine for every floor in their building, and they actually trained their employees like for half an hour to an hour how to use the coffee machine. So think about this, right? So we will actually spend time to train people on using the coffee machine in the office, which, I mean, depending on how caffeine dependent you are, might or might not increase the productivity, but we won't talk about Power Platform. And that's the thing that we need to fix, right? So here's some nurturing approaches, right? So first thing is like have an onboarding strategy, right? One of the focus areas is to make sure that all new users that are new to Power Platform and Power Apps can have the resource they need to be productive and use these tools. So in my experience, one of the ways to do this is when you roll out Power Platform in an organization, your users become intrigued. They're like, oh, what's this cool button? What does it do? Because think about it. It's on every list. It's on every, in SharePoint, it's in every list, in every document library. You can do an app, you can do a flow. People click it. You can't really stop them from doing that. And then this is where trouble starts. And their curiosity might land them in the template area where they try some other things that are in the popular areas that have nothing to do with what they were clicking about. And so beyond some of those simple templates, people will actually want to use additional sources to tackle their use case. So a great way to embrace these users is to make sure they get off to a good start by sending them a welcome email. And I'll show you how to do that. But that includes the things that you want them to know about. right? The validated resource, the company-specific resources, and the links to upcoming internal events to help them. And then you have things like App in a Day. I love doing App in a Day. Lots of material out there that allows people to get started building Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agent, and so on and so forth in a day on your own. And that's a great way to do it. You also have things like teams-based initiatives, right? So instead of rolling out Power Platform to everyone and embracing everyone in the organization, maybe you want to go for those people that are a bit more aggressive, that are a bit more willing to, I always say they're bleeding, right? They're suffering. They just they'll take anything and they don't care how much they have to go through a learning curve. Empower those people because they're the ones that are going to make a difference in your organization. Now you get your ambassadors and your champions, and there's two separate types of people. Not everyone is a good champion, right? So you can actually use, and I'll show you very shortly, you can use the out-of-the-box Power Automate and Power Apps analytics to help you identify those top makers in the organization and make them the champions and the ambassadors. They're the ones that are going to go, look at this cool thing that I did, and they're going to make everybody else jealous, and everybody's going to be like, not fair, I want one of those. But the other thing you can do is you can actually use the COE starter kit. COE is the Center of Excellence starter kit, and I'll be talking about that a lot today. There's a dashboard in the COE starter kit that will give you a tenant-wide overview of all the makers in the organization and what connectors they're using to create the apps. And you can see the top apps and the top flow makers and the departments they're from, and you can identify those trends over time. And then you want to train and upskill, right? It's important to think about your upskilling strategy for makers because you want them to do the right thing, right? You don't want them to be doing silly apps that are doing the wrong things. So you want to make sure that your new, your intermediate, and advanced makers have at least resources available. And I'm not saying you need to spend time to train them, like to put them aside from their job, but give them resources or make sure that they have access to e-learning things or forums or documentation. And then you can have community events like lunch and learns, user groups. There's online conferences, happy hours, which Denzel and I were talking about earlier, to create a place where people can just connect and share their ideas outside of kind of the business hours, or even outside of the organization with like-minded people. I run with David Warner. I run something called the Citizen Developer User Group, which is a monthly meeting where we just do that. We just connect and we talk about how we're going to embrace citizen developers in the organization. And then we'll talk about the COE starter kit a little bit more. So let's move on here. But the starter kit, this is what I was talking about here. You got your champions, right? So if you have Microsoft 365 in your organization, it's likely that you have some people that have already discovered Power Apps. They just clicked around, and then they have Power Apps popping up in Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive. You can actually go to your analytics in the admin center, or you can use the COE starter kit dashboard. Even without like that organic adoption, right? If maybe you got started before people discovered the buttons, it's likely that you already have a good feeling of who your champions are. They're the ones that use Excel and Access and SharePoint, the way that you're like, oh, my God, they're doing this again. They're the troublemakers that are pushing the boundaries. They're the ones that are always first in line when there's something new to learn. They're the ones that discover issues that you just hope that no one will ever discover. They question, they query, they encourage, right? Train those people, make them your best friends, make them the champions to help them train others. Because again, if those people are passionate, they will find a way to make these things happen. But they can also be like the loudest detractors if you don't embrace them. And then you can see using the COE starter kit, right? You can see kind of all the trends, the top apps, everything, how many different connectors they're using and things like that. It's a great resource. And again, the COE starter kit is free. We'll talk about it shortly. The other ways that your champions, I can't say that word, champions can support you is you can actually kind of set up a SharePoint site or a wiki that allows you to clearly communicate kind of the purpose of your default environment, and the purpose of shared team and employee productivity environment, as well as all the other environments that makers might have access to, right? So for example, a training environment, and the process of how to request access to those environments. Tell them about the purpose of a trial environment and how to request them, and the purpose of a developer environment and how to create them, and how to request custom environments for specific business unit or project purposes. Again, I know we haven't talked about environment strategy, but we'll talk about that too. And then the responsibility of the maker, right, is like keep the tenant clean, delete your environments, your apps, your flows if they're no longer needed. How many times have you seen, test apps in your Power Platform environments? So use test environment if you're experimenting. Share wisely, right? Watch out for oversharing your environments, your apps, your flows, and shared connections, and protect your organizational data. Avoid moving data from highly confidential or confidential data sources to non-protected or external storage. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. So create a program, right? Find your champions who can commit time and effort. Focus on those people, right? Build a Teams community or Yammer if you're using Yammer. Provide material that's ready to support their work, right? So access to training material and template. Ensure that there's a regular rhythm for discussions where the champions can talk about what they're working on and stuff like that. Design a program to like encourage and recognize their effort, like such as maybe like providing a privileged access to relevant events or speaking engagements. Incorporate your Power Platform training resources in your own internal training sites and create contests like scavenger hunts, giveaways, hackathons between departments to encourage people to interact with the Power Platform. And encourage the sharing of stories, and we'll show you that shortly, but just do show and tell sessions and highlight the work that people have done. That's a great way, and there's lots of really great case studies on organizations that have done this where they've been super successful. And so just recognize and reward the work the champions are doing. Like, remember that they're not a support team but they're just business representatives, right? Is there a company that rewards benefit programs that for work that you could tie into, right? Hey, well, there you go. Like, or maybe, I don't know, maybe there's vouchers, right, for free coffee at the new coffee machine that they could receive, or maybe they could benefit from getting a premium license or their own environment to play in. Whatever it is, encourage those people. So this is a welcome email. This is actually something that's available as a template, but it's a welcome email that welcomes people who are part of when they just activate their Power Platform or their, and it adds them to the security group. And you can see that you can customize these resources to meet your needs. So now you're starting to, this is the electronic equivalent of doing the coffee machine training. Here, you have a new resource that's available to you. It's called Microsoft Power Platform. Here's how to use it properly. Here's how not to use it. Let's get you started. And then there's things like app catalogs and things like that. There's things like app catalogs and things like that that allows you to make your apps more discoverable. And then again, we've talked about using like sharing your templates and your reusable components. So find those champions who can commit time and effort, and then like align their objectives with the organizational objectives and vision, right? Get sponsorship from stakeholders and the executives, and focus on the people. All right, we talked about sharing success stories, but when people do awesome stuff, highlight it. You would be amazed how someone who's doing something that's not their job to do does some minor improvement that maybe increases their team's productivity. You would be amazed when you celebrate it, the impact that it has, because there's going to be people that didn't know these tools were available, and there's going to be people that are going to be like, oh, I want that too, right? Me too. I want to do this. I didn't know I could do this. All right, so we'll talk about, you can organize internal trainings and things like that, but let's move on. We talked about training in a day, right? There's tons of training in a day events. You can do them internally. You can actually ask for Microsoft to help you doing them, and you can even ask for partners to help you do them. And then you need to start thinking about your tiers for applications, right? You're going to have some mission critical apps, you're going to have some important apps and productivity apps, and understanding, who's managing these, because the mission critical apps, you probably want the IT to support them. You have important apps, well, you probably want them to be blessed by IT. They're not managed by IT or supported by IT, but they're blessed, right? Like IT goes, yeah, okay, I'll allow this. And then you've got the ones that are more just personal productivity. They're just supported by the app maker. IT is not getting involved in this, not at this point. All right, so let's go to the next step. Path to Zen, right? So we've talked about securing, we've talked about nurturing. Let's talk about monitoring. So anything when it comes to business process, right? Monitoring is always about planning, monitoring, and adapting. And I hope the arrows are going the right way. So planning is saying, okay, we think that this is what people are going to do. Now let's take a look at whether this is really what's happening, and let's adapt. Let's constantly change. So thankfully, the Center of Excellence, right, allows you to do this kind of stuff. It helps you kind of drive innovation and improvement, and then it brings together that kind of like-minded people and similar business goals, and to share the knowledge and see like their standards and consistency and governance. So when you put the COE starter kit, like it's kind of a collection of components you install in your environment, and we'll send you links, but you can actually download the COE from GitHub repository. And the one thing, and I can't stress this enough, the kit doesn't just represent the entire Center of Excellence, because Center of Excellence is more than technology alone. It's more than a tool. It also requires the people, the communication, the culture, right? And defining the requirements and the processes. So the tools are just a start. And I always like to make sure that I call it a starter kit or an accelerator, not just the COE itself, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So what are some of the tools that are available, right? One of the things you can do, for example, is you can identify orphaned apps in your environment and assign them owners, because maybe someone's moved on, and assign them new owners using the app in the Power BI dashboard. So the starter kit is available at AK.ms COE starter kit. I'm not gonna actually go through this in details, because again, the point of this is all the stuff around the starter kit about increasing adoption and governance. The starter kit itself are the set of tools that you can follow the instructions on how to install it. We're going to continue talking about the stuff that's not covered in the instructions. So the building blocks of the starter kit, kind of like there's the admin stuff, right, for the administrators to kind of gain the insight and monitor the Power Platform adoption. You got the governance, which is around establishing audit, compliance, and archive process, right? You want to make sure that you're think about things like non-repudiation, right? People not being able to say, no, I never deleted this, I never did this. You've got audit in place, you got compliance in place to make sure that these things happen. And then the starter kit has the nurture building blocks that helps you accelerate the adoption. We've just talked about this, but like all the best practices to onboard new makers, to create excitement, that's built in. And that's really something you would use to target the admins, the makers, the end users. And then you got the theming, right? So the ability, because if you think about it, when you're starting to embrace Power Platform, you're going to start by having individuals that are going to build, okay, I always say, and this is rude, I apologize, but I always say, if it's easy for people to build apps, it's also easy for people to build shitty apps. So start actually investing in establishing themes, establishing common controls and things like that, so that the apps start looking more consistent, and that they are they have a standardized design language, and you have the tools to be able to do this within the building blocks of the starter kit. So an example of this is you can monitor the connector usage, right? You can see who's using what, how it's being used. It allows you to change, well, do I need to change my DLP policies, disable the flows that are using the connectors improperly? And that you can automate that in the COE starter kit as well. And then you get your application monitoring, right? The COE toolkit just gives you your administrators a summary view of all the applications. And then you can identify the source of new apps and find like the pockets of success. Find those apps because that will help you again understand the apps that are broadly shared and control them. You know, hey, wait a minute, I didn't realize that everyone in the company was using this tool that was built by Mary in accounting. Maybe we need to start looking at this as a more IT supported initiative, right? Because maybe it's becoming a more mission critical solution. And then the other thing is to look at the risk assessment that's built in, one of the tools that's available, right? So it kind of aggregates the data from across all the platforms to help you kind of evaluate all these orphan apps, right? The apps where the owner has left the organization, and find those that are based on templates like training and evaluation exercises, and then identify the implicitly shared connectors to ensure that they're being used properly. There's lots of other stuff here, like the Power Platform admin view, and it allows you to like maintain a database of all the applications and kind of providing a structure for your application review cycle. Because yeah, you should probably review these applications regularly, but we're not going to cover that today. We're going to move on to our next path to Zen. So we've talked about security, nurturing, monitoring. Let's talk about creating the environment strategy. Wait a minute. I didn't create an environment strategy yet. Remember what we've talked about is the first thing is about just getting people to get started as quickly as possible. Yes, you do need your environment strategy, and yes, it should be one of the earliest things that you do. But in terms of priorities, if you kind of create your policies and you secure everything and you start monitoring, it'll help you kind of decide and determine your long-term environment strategy. So things to know about environments. There's a few things that you need to know, right? The environments are tied to a geographic location that's configured when you create the environment. The environments can also be used to target different audiences and or different purposes, such as, let's say, dev, test, and production. Every tenant has a default environment where all the licensed Power Apps and Flow users can create their apps, and that's called the default environment. By the way, I recommend rename that to, instead of default, like personal productivity or something like that. The non-default environments offer a lot more control over permissions, and the non-default environments creation can also be restricted to only like the global service admins from the Power Platform Admin Center. And so that's aka the MS PPAC. Oops, going the wrong way again. All right, so when you define your environment strategy, you kind of want to assign, right? Assign your admins. And then you want to assign the roles to provide like administrative access to Power Apps, Canvas app flows, model-driven apps, and so on and so forth. Then you want to restrict the creation of net new trial and production environments. So limiting the environment creation is kind of beneficial for you to maintain control in general, both to prevent unaccounted capacity consumption, like I've seen recently, and to reduce the number of environments that you have to manage. If the users have to request an environment from central IT, it's easier to see what people are working on if admins are kind of like the gatekeeper, as opposed to people creating free-for-all environments. Treat the default environment as the personal productivity environment, like I've talked about. In fact, I recommend renaming it all the time. So do that through the admin center. Just make the purpose clear, right? It needs to be self-explanatory. And then clearly communicate that default is never to be used for production apps, just for personal apps that aren't meant to be used by many people. Establish a process for requesting access and or creating new environments, right? So when your environment creation is locked down and the default is reserved for specifically personal apps, then make it clear to developers in your organization that a proper development project should be started by requesting a new dedicated environment. Now, don't make it hard for them because they're going to go around and bypass you. But again, make it clear to them. This is the process. And in the next section, we'll talk about some details about automated environment creation and stuff like that. And then you have your dev, test, production environments for specific business groups and applications. So having these stage environments ensures that the changes created during environment won't break the end user stuff, right? Because again, we'll talk about that. And then you have the individual use environments for proof of concept and training workshops. Actually, let's just do this. Let's talk about kind of the considerations of the types of apps, right? We've talked about you got critical apps, you got like mission critical scenarios that are owned by everybody, and maybe they are not owned by, but used by everybody. And those are supported and owned by IT. Those are the ones you want to kind of follow a robust application lifecycle management. You got your important apps that are maybe not critical, but they're kind of huge in the organization. And maybe they're supported by the app owner, but they're blessed by the IT. And then you've got kind of the productivity, which is like Marion Accounting just built an app that she needed. Now, let's talk about these environments quickly. Let's talk about kind of the main goals, right? So if we look at the personal productivity environments where you got kind of two scenarios. I've got one which is the default, which is everyone's a maker. Again, you can't turn that off, and I would never recommend to turn it off because this is really intended for people to just get things done faster. But again, make it clear, it's not for development of critical apps. You also have the developer environments where usually one user has access, right? So Hugo Dev would be my environment. I get to do kind of my stuff in my own little dev environment, but I don't get to have multiple people in that environment. And we'll talk about the processes for this. So again, I can't stress this enough. The default, it's not for development of critical app. Tell people, threaten them if you have to. And then again, if your development environments are completely locked for any other user but the user who's subscribed to the community plan, because that's a plan that developers can use, then the applications can be moved out of that environment if needed. Then you've got your critical projects, like the super important stuff, right? Where you actually want to create a dedicated dev, test, production environment for each critical application. Your dev environments, makers have access to the dev environment. Yeah, it makes sense. They probably shouldn't even have access to develop in test and prod. So they only have user access in test and prod. And end users only have access to the production solution. No one can modify the application. It has to go through a rigorous deployment process. And then the individual projects, right? It really depends on what's going on. So you might have apps that are shared by multiple projects or business units. And then so the way this would work is, again, I kind of covered it here, but your end users have only basic user access to solutions and data and production environment. All right, let's move on. We still got some stuff. Clearly communicate your strategy to your makers, right? Tell them why default and shared is important. Talk to them about your trial and developer environments, the process of requesting custom environments, and the responsibilities of a maker. We've talked about this before, but again, I can't reiterate that often enough. All right, so now we've got all this stuff going. How do we get more Zen? Well, we talked about the environment strategy. We need to talk about application lifecycle management. Now we're running out of time, but if you look at kind of whether you use Azure DevOps or you use GitHub, you can actually kind of apply an application lifecycle management. So what do we mean by that? The ability to kind of create and build and release your environment going through the whole testing thing. So as kind of you mature and your environment strategy starts to mature as well, right? You include your dev, test, and production environments and the scenarios. You want to start looking for that automated process, because when I start building in a solution that is used by everyone in the company, it's mission critical, the last thing I should be doing is deploying it by hand, or maybe give some person or a whole bunch of people access to go change that application in production. It should be deployed through an automated process, and the tools are built in already to do this. So the Power Apps Build tool, they offer kind of that seamless integration with Azure DevOps and GitHub. And the Power Apps Build tool that are tools that are available for your Dataverse environment, and you can actually do the build tasks, you can do actions in GitHub, and allows either your developers, your pro developers, to actually move the source from one environment to another. in a fully automated way. So one way to do this, by the way, is, for example, in your production, don't give anybody access to deploying the app. Use that service account that is responsible for deploying the app. That's the only thing that's able to deploy in production. That way, you're never going to have someone deploying something by accident because you're using an approval process. So kind of let's highlight the sections here. So the first thing, your build pipeline kind of instantiates kind of that pristine development environment, right? So you create the development environments, you export the solutions, you unpack the solutions, and you put them in source control. Then you actually build the pipelines to automate kind of a lot of manual steps, like so doing things like unit test. But you start getting away from uploading the solution, manually exporting the solution, unpacking all that stuff. Like you automate all that stuff. And then releasing stuff without doing it manually, either through a weekly, daily, or hourly release. It just becomes the new standard. And you can actually build in an approval process. So it can only be deployed through a maintenance window. You can book, let's say, a ServiceNow thing, or you can automate, because again, this is using Power Platform. So all the cool features that we've talked about, all those cool connectors, you can leverage all that to integrate into your application lifecycle management. All right, so we've talked about all these things. What's next? Well, that center of excellence we've talked about, it's a kick-ass tool. But again, it's the start. And that's why it's the last step, even though it should probably have been the first step in this roadmap. It's the last step in this road to Zen, because establishing the center of excellence is only the start. This is where things is going to get fun. And you're going to continue evolving your processes, your standards, and your knowledge. So establish that Power Platform Center of Excellence and find that balance between admin and governance and nurturing and supporting, right? Your responsibility here is to kind of find the balance between the two and understand where governance is not the goal, but it's for you to govern and accelerate your adoption. You govern to nurture. So you can start learning more about the Center of Excellence. You can go to ak.ms/Power Platform Labs to just start doing some labs. You can actually kind of access lots of online learning and stuff like that, and you can learn more about Power Apps. But if you want to focus more on things like learning with the community, right, you can actually join the community. This is a way long URL that I don't expect you to remember. Find the local user groups, right? April Dunham does a great user group, great series of videos and stuff like that. Like, I encourage to, I get to say that because she's not here, but I encourage you to actually go look at her videos and her events and stuff like that, because she really kicks ass at this. And then join your online kind of user groups. Go to the Citizen Developer User Group, and then there's summits out there. So go to the summits where we all talk about these things, because this is the same problem that we're all going to be faced. How do I increase governance and increase adoption and have that balance? So today, it was a whirlwind tour, but we showed you kind of the ways to get started from zero to hero in terms of governance in the Power Platform and how to achieve that balance. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you. And if there's any questions, I'll take them in the chat window. Thank you, everyone.